In the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, where the earth still bears the deep scars of old coal mines, there lies a cemetery plot that has confounded historians for more than 100 years. 7 identical headstones stand in a perfect row, each bearing the Murphy surname, each marking the final resting place of a young man who died at the precise age of 21. Between 1847 and 1883, every single male heir of the Murphy line met his end on his 21st birthday under conditions so varied, yet so unnervingly consistent, that local law enforcement eventually ceased their inquiries. The Pennsylvania State Archives hold over 300 pages of testimonies, medical evaluations, and witness accounts that were sealed by state mandate in 1884, only to be discreetly moved to a restricted vault in Harrisburg. What you are about to hear has never been shared in full, reconstructed from recently unearthed family correspondence, court documents, and the private journal of Dr. Ezra Caldwell, the physician who attended 4 of these deaths and devoted his final years to meticulously recording what he termed Murphy Affliction. Now, before we go deeper into the story of the Murphy family and the inexplicable tragedy that shadowed an entire community for almost 40 years, I need you to do something for me. If you're captivated by historical enigmas like this one, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you're always the first to explore America's most hidden secrets. And tell me in the comments below which state or city you're listening from. I genuinely love connecting with fellow mystery lovers from all across the country. The reality of what happened to the Murphy sons is far more unsettling than any supernatural tale could ever be. Anchored in the brutal truths of 19th century industrial America, generational family secrets, and a conspiracy of silence that shielded the powerful at the expense of the innocent. The year was 1846 when Sheamus Murphy first set foot in Milfield, Pennsylvania, a booming coal town nestled in the Appalachian foothills, roughly 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Like thousands of Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine, Sheamus arrived with little more than work-toughened hands, an unbreakable will, and dreams of prosperity in this new land. But unlike most refugees who came destitute and desperate, Sheamus possessed something that would prove both a gift and a burden, a letter of introduction from an enigmatic patron in Ireland who had secured his passage and guaranteed him a position with the Keystone Coal and Iron Company. Milfield was a company town in the truest sense. Its dusty lanes were bordered by identical wooden houses painted a uniform gray. Its entire economy relied on Keystone's massive operation, which employed over 800 men in a labyrinth of mines tunneling through the surrounding mountains. The corporation owned everything from the general store to the church pews, from the schoolhouse to the burial plots, crafting a closed society where every facet of existence was dictated by corporate policy. Even the town's name was a corporate creation. The original settlement had been called Greenale, but Keystone had renamed it to reflect their vision of industrial efficiency over natural charm. What set Milfield apart from other company towns was the deliberate curation of its labor force. Instead of hiring any able-bodied man who appeared, Keystone had engineered a sophisticated recruitment apparatus that targeted specific families from particular regions of Europe, especially those escaping political turmoil or economic collapse. These families arrived not as random immigrants, but as carefully selected participants in what company records politely termed the settlement program, a comprehensive framework of housing, jobs, and community development that offered security in return for lifelong loyalty. At 28, Sheamus was older than most new arrivals, his weathered face telling a story of the hardships that had driven him across the ocean. He had a keen mind for mathematics and an uncommon literacy in both English and Gaelic, skills that quickly drew the notice of Josiah Bentley, Keystone's operations manager. Bentley was a slender, shrewd man in his 40s who had converted Milfield from a struggling mining outpost into one of Pennsylvania's most profitable ventures through what he termed innovative labor management. Within a month, Sheamus was elevated from the mines to the company's accounting office, a promotion that placed him above most immigrants, but also positioned him to witness the true extent of Keystone's dominion over its workers. The ledgers he maintained held more than simple payroll data. They chronicled every detail of the employees' lives, from their debts at the company store to their presence at company-sponsored sermons, from their children's grades in the company school to extensive notes on their political views and social connections. It was in this office, surrounded by ledgers thick with coal dust and heavy with the secrets of others, that Sheamus encountered Margaret O'Connell. She was the daughter of Dermot O'Connell, one of the first Irish families recruited for the settlement program, and she worked as a seamstress for the wives of company foremen. Margaret had an education rare for a woman of her station. She could read Latin as well as English, having been instructed by nuns in Ireland before her family's emigration, and she had cultivated a sharp perception for the inconsistencies and mysteries that permeated life in Milfield. Their courtship was brief but intense, partly because a genuine bond formed quickly between them, but also because both sensed that their individual survival within Milfield's intricate social structure would be strengthened through marriage. They were wed in the autumn of 1846 in the town's modest Catholic church, a ceremony attended by over 200 people, but officiated by Father McKenna, a priest whose sermons consistently highlighted the virtues of loyalty, obedience, and accepting one's God-appointed station. Margaret was a beauty by any measure, with raven-black hair and eyes the color of gathering storms, but more crucial to Sheamus, she possessed a fierce intellect and shared his mounting disquiet about the real nature of their supposed good fortune. Their newlywed cottage on Elm Street was among the better houses available to Irish families, but it came with unspoken regulations about their comings and goings, who they could welcome, and what subjects were suitable for discussion, in a home they slowly realized was never truly their own. By the spring of 1847, Margaret was expecting their first child, and Sheamus had saved enough to buy a small parcel of land on the town's outskirts, where he intended to build a proper home for his expanding family. But when he approached the company's land office to finalize the purchase, he discovered it was contingent on signing additional agreements that would commit his unborn children to the settlement program, ensuring their employment with Keystone when they came of age. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret suffered from severe morning sickness that persisted well into her second trimester, but more alarming were the bizarre dreams that haunted her sleep. She described visions of standing in an immense graveyard filled with matching headstones, each inscribed with the name of a young man she had never met yet somehow knew. Dr. Caldwell, the town's sole physician, a man whose medical training had been augmented by years of observing the peculiar patterns of sickness and death in Milfield, prescribed bed rest and laudanum for her distress, but privately noted in his diary that he had witnessed similar symptoms in other expectant mothers whose husbands held positions of trust within the company. The town itself was a tinderbox of tensions that extended far beyond the usual ethnic rivalries. The Irish Catholics, like the Murphys, faced prejudice from the Protestant German and English families who had come earlier. Yet all laborers existed under the perpetual threat of cave-ins, explosions, and the company's iron-fisted control over their lives. Wages were paid in company scrip that could only be used at company stores, trapping families in endless debt. But more sinister was the structure of social advancement that rewarded compliance and penalized independence. Union organizers who tried to enter the town were met with brutality, and more than one agitator had simply disappeared into the surrounding woodlands, never to be seen again. Yet there were also rumors murmured in the Irish quarters about families who had attempted to leave Milfield and found their departures obstructed by mysterious legal entanglements or sudden financial crises that made it impossible to settle their debts to the company. It was against this backdrop of industrial oppression and concealed coercion that the Murphy family would endure their first tragedy, one that would unveil the true price of the prosperity Keystone had promised its carefully chosen workforce. The baby Margaret carried would be born healthy and robust, a son they named Patrick after Sheamus's father. But from his first breath, Patrick Murphy was marked by a fate decided long before his parents ever reached Pennsylvania, a destiny that would claim not only his life, but the lives of every male heir to follow in the coming decades. Patrick Murphy's 21st birthday arrived cold and bleak on March 15, 1868. Snow still clung to the mountains encircling Milfield, and the morning air carried the sharp scent of coal smoke mixed with the metallic hint that often precedes a storm. Sheamus had arranged a modest celebration at McBride's Tavern, one of the few establishments in town that served Irish Catholics, but Patrick seemed uncharacteristically quiet as he dressed for work that morning. Margaret noticed her eldest son's pallid complexion as he sat at their kitchen table, hardly touching the substantial breakfast she had made. "You're looking pale, my boy," she said, pressing her hand to his forehead. Maybe you should stay home today." But Patrick, who had inherited his father's stubbornness along with his dark Irish looks, insisted he was fine. He had recently been promoted to shift supervisor in the mine's deepest tunnel, a role that brought both greater responsibility and increased scrutiny from the company bosses. Missing work on his birthday would raise suspicions he couldn't afford. The morning shift started promptly at 6:00 a.m., with the miners assembling in the Lamfaus to collect their gear before descending into the earth. Patrick's crew included 12 men, mostly Irish like himself, though a few German immigrants had been reluctantly accepted into their ranks. The tunnel they worked was known as Shaft 7, nearly 400 feet below ground, where the coal seam was especially rich, but also notoriously unstable. At exactly 2:17 in the afternoon, according to the company's official report, a methane gas explosion ripped through Shaft 7 with devastating force. The blast echoed throughout the town, rattling windows and sending women rushing into the streets, their faces blanched with fear. Mine explosions were common enough in those days, but this one was different. More contained, more precise than the random accidents that periodically took miners' lives. When rescue teams finally reached the area 3 hours later, they found 11 men unconscious but alive, their bodies hurled against the tunnel walls by the blast's force. Patrick Murphy was discovered at the very center of the explosion site, his body untouched by fire or falling rock, lying peacefully as if he had simply lain down to sleep. Dr. Caldwell, among the first to examine the scene, would later write in his private journal that Patrick seemed to have died not from the explosion itself, but from what he described as a cessation of vital functions occurring at the precise moment of the blast. The other miners, when they regained consciousness, all recounted the same strange tale. They had been working normally when Patrick abruptly stopped mid-sentence, checked his pocket watch, and smiled. "A time's up," he had said, though none understood his meaning. Seconds later, the explosion had torn through their section of the mine. Making the incident even more bizarre was the discovery 3 days later of a letter in Patrick's coat pocket, written in his own hand but dated 2 weeks earlier. It contained specific instructions for his burial and a list of personal items to be given to his siblings. At the bottom, in his characteristic neat script, were the words, "The first payment is made. The debt continues with my brothers." The company investigation concluded that Patrick had somehow triggered the explosion through carelessness, though they could never explain how one man could cause such destruction or why he alone had perished, while his crew survived. Keystone Coal and Iron paid a small settlement to the Murphy family and ordered the incident report sealed, citing sensitivity to ongoing operations. But Dr. Caldwell kept his own files, and his growing doubts about the true cause of Patrick's death would prove prophetic when, exactly 5 years later, the second Murphy son would keep his own appointment with destiny. The death of Patrick Murphy cast a long shadow over the family, but grief has a way of blunting even the sharpest mysteries, and life in Milfield continued with its familiar rhythms of labor and survival. Sheamus buried himself in his work at the company office with renewed intensity, as if ledger books and inventory counts could protect him from the questions that haunted his nights. Margaret aged a decade in the months after Patrick's funeral. Her once vibrant hair now streaked with premature gray, her storm-colored eyes often distant and unfocused. But it was their second son, Thomas, who seemed most transformed by his older brother's death. Where Patrick had been serious and dutiful, Thomas had a reckless edge that concerned his parents. He had inherited his mother's sharp intellect, but lacked Patrick's steady nature, frequently finding himself in trouble with company supervisors for challenging orders or standing up for fellow workers. In the years following Patrick's death, Thomas began asking uncomfortable questions about the explosion in Shaft 7. He spent hours in the town's small library, scouring mining safety reports and newspaper accounts of similar incidents. He interviewed the surviving miners from his brother's crew, most of whom had since left Milfield or found other work, unwilling to return underground after their experience. What Thomas uncovered disturbed him profoundly. Mining records showed that Shaft 7 had been declared unsafe in previous inspections, with dangerous methane levels detected in the weeks before the explosion. More troubling was his discovery that Patrick had been asked to work a double shift on the day he died, despite company rules forbidding such overtime in hazardous areas. Most damning of all was a letter he found among his father's papers, written by Josiah Bentley himself, ordering Patrick to perform a special inspection of the tunnel's gas pockets on his birthday. When Thomas confronted his father about the letter, Sheamus's reaction was immediate and violent. The quiet, studious man who had spent years building a reputation for integrity suddenly became someone his son scarcely recognized, his face flushing with anger as he snatched the document from Thomas's hands and threw it into the fire. "Some secrets are better left buried, boy," Sheamus said, his voice barely a whisper but carrying a threat that made Thomas step back. "Your brother is gone, and no amount of digging will bring him back. Drop this nonsense before you join him." But Thomas, now nearing his own 20th birthday, refused to let the matter rest. He began meeting in secret with former Keystone employees who had left the company under dubious circumstances, and what they told him sketched a picture of corruption and conspiracy extending far beyond a simple mining accident. There were tales of union organizers who had died in mishaps after getting too close to exposing safety violations, of whistleblowers who had simply vanished into the Pennsylvania wilderness, and of a hidden pact between Keystone Coal and Iron and certain influential families in the region that guaranteed profitable operations at any cost. Most disturbing were the stories the older miners called blood contracts, agreements made decades earlier that bound certain families to the company in ways that went far beyond ordinary employment. These contracts, according to the rumors, demanded specific forms of payment that could only be settled through death. And the payments came due with clockwork regularity, always on significant birthdays, always targeting the young men who might otherwise carry on their family names and challenge the established order. As Thomas's 21st birthday approached in the spring of 1873, he grew increasingly paranoid and unpredictable. He started carrying a pistol and refused to work alone, convinced someone was tracking him through Milfield's streets. His mother found him one morning standing at his bedroom window, fully dressed despite the early hour, watching the sunrise with a look of deep sorrow. "They're coming for me, Ma," he said without turning. "Oh, just like they came for Patrick, but I won't make it easy for them." Margaret Murphy tried to dismiss her son's fears as grief and imagination, but in her heart she felt the cold grip of dread. The night before Thomas's birthday, she knelt before the small shrine she had built in her bedroom, surrounded by candles and rosaries, and prayed with a desperation bordering on madness. But some prayers, she would soon learn, are answered in ways that offer no comfort, only deeper mysteries and more profound sorrow. The dawn of Thomas Murphy's 21st birthday brought a fog so dense the mountains around Milfield vanished, leaving the town feeling isolated and vulnerable, cut off from the outside world like a ship adrift in a sea of gray. Thomas Murphy had made careful plans for his 21st birthday, but no preparation could have ready him for the sequence of events that would unfold on that fog-shrouded morning of March 22nd, 1873. Unlike his brother Patrick, who had met his end in the familiar darkness of the mine shafts, Thomas's death would happen in full daylight, witnessed by dozens, yet remain just as baffling and unsettling. He had taken the day off from his job at the company's timber mill, claiming sickness, and instead positioned himself in the bell tower of St. Michael's Catholic Church, which offered a panoramic view of all approaches to Milfield. Armed with his father's old hunting rifle and a box of cartridges, Thomas had turned the sacred space into a stronghold, barricading the narrow staircase with heavy wooden benches. Father O'Malley, the elderly priest who had baptized all the Murphy children, discovered Thomas's presence during his morning prayers. The young man's appearance shocked the cleric. Hollow-eyed and gaunt, Thomas had clearly not slept in days, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame as if he had stopped eating altogether. "Thomas, my son," the priest said softly, approaching with his hands open and empty. "What troubles bring you to God's house with such weapons?" Thomas's reply was disjointed and desperate, a torrent of accusations, and pleas that depicted a conspiracy so vast and deep-rooted that Father O'Malley initially dismissed it as the ravings of a young man crushed by grief. But as Thomas spoke, supplying specific dates, names, and details that only someone with inside knowledge could possess, the priest's skepticism began to yield to a growing horror. According to Thomas, his brother Patrick had not died in a random mining accident, but had been deliberately killed as part of a grotesque ritual that bound the Murphy family to Keystone Coal and Iron through what he called a contract written in blood. The explosion in Shaft 7 had been meticulously orchestrated, timed to occur at the exact moment of Patrick's 21st birthday, fulfilling an obligation established decades earlier through circumstances Thomas claimed to understand but refused to fully explain. "They're coming for me today, Father," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "And when I'm gone, they'll come for Michael, and then for James and for little Brendan. Every son, every 21st birthday, until the debt is paid in full, or there are no more Murphy men left to sacrifice. Father O'Malley tried to calm the young man, offering prayers and solace. But Thomas was beyond comforting. He had spent months investigating his brother's death and claimed to have uncovered documents proving the blood contract's existence, though he had hidden these papers in a location he wouldn't reveal. His plan was straightforward. Thus, from his perch in the bell tower, he would identify whoever came to kill him and shoot them before they could complete their mission, breaking the cycle of death that had claimed Patrick and now threatened his entire family. At exactly noon, as the church bells began their daily toll, Thomas suddenly stiffened and pointed toward the town's main street. "There," he whispered to Father O'Malley. "Do you see them? 3 men in dark coats walking this way. They're not from Milfield. I don't recognize any of them." The priest peered through the narrow window but saw only the normal midday activity of townsfolk going about their business. The fog had thinned slightly, but visibility remained poor, and he couldn't distinguish the figures that had captured Thomas's attention. When he turned back to the young man, he found Thomas raising the rifle to his shoulder, his finger on the trigger, his face a mask of grim resolve. What happened next would be debated by witnesses for years. At the precise moment Thomas Murphy pulled the trigger, aiming at what he believed were his approaching executioners, the rifle exploded in his hands with impossible force. The weapon had been meticulously maintained and recently checked, but it disintegrated as if packed with far more gunpowder than any standard cartridge could hold. The blast killed Thomas instantly, his body hurled against the bell tower's stone wall with such violence that Father O'Malley, despite his decades of comforting the grieving and blessing the dead, fainted from the shock. When the priest regained consciousness 20 minutes later, he found Thomas's body in a position that would haunt his dreams forever. The young man was kneeling, his hands clasped in prayer, his face serene and unmarked by the violence that had killed him. The investigation into Thomas Murphy's death was perfunctory at best. Company officials declared it a tragic accident caused by faulty ammunition, and the rifle's manufacturer, a respected Philadelphia firm, could offer no explanation for the weapon's catastrophic failure. The 3 mysterious strangers Thomas had spotted were never identified, if they had ever existed at all. But Father O'Malley kept his own counsel about what he had witnessed, writing detailed accounts in a private journal that wouldn't be found until after his death, 30 years later. And in that journal he recorded one detail the official inquiry had missed. At the moment of Thomas's death, every clock in Milfield had stopped at exactly the same time, freezing the town in a silence that lasted precisely 21 seconds before time resumed its normal flow. The death of Thomas Murphy sent tremors through Milfield's tight-knit Irish community, but it was Sheamus Murphy's reaction that truly alarmed those who knew the family well. Instead of collapsing into grief, as he had after Patrick's death, Sheamus became a man driven by a fury bordering on insanity. He stormed into the offices of Keystone Coal and Iron the morning after his son's funeral, demanding to see Josiah Bentley and clutching a leather satchel with white-knuckled intensity. What transpired during that meeting remains one of the Murphy case's central mysteries, as both men took extraordinary steps to ensure their conversations stayed private. But Clara Hoffman, Bentley's secretary, later told her sister she heard raised voices through the manager's heavy oak door, followed by sounds of objects being thrown and furniture being overturned. When Sheamus finally emerged 2 hours later, his face was ashen, and the leather satchel was gone. Bentley, for his part, seemed equally shaken by whatever had occurred. Mrs. Hoffman reported that her employer canceled all appointments for the rest of the week and spent long hours staring out his office window at the encircling mountains. On Friday evening, he summoned her to take dictation for what he called a matter of urgent personal business. But when she arrived with her stenography equipment, she found him motionless at his desk, apparently having reconsidered whatever he had planned to reveal. The changes in Sheamus Murphy were even more dramatic. The man once known for his meticulous attention to detail and unwavering honesty began making errors in the company books, mistakes so obvious and frequent that even charitable observers wondered if they were deliberate. He started drinking heavily, arriving at work with whiskey on his breath, and growing increasingly hostile toward his colleagues. Most disturbing of all, he began speaking openly about what he called the price of prosperity and warning other immigrant families to be wary of opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Margaret Murphy watched her husband's decline into bitterness and alcohol with mounting desperation, but her own conduct was becoming increasingly erratic as well. She had started visiting the town's small cemetery each evening, not just to tend her two dead sons' graves, but to study the headstones of other young men who had died under suspicious circumstances over the years. Her research uncovered a pattern that chilled her to the bone. At least a dozen families in Milfield had lost male heirs at age 21, all in accidents that seemed random but shared certain unsettling similarities. There was Johann Steiner, a German immigrant's son who had fallen from a construction scaffold in 1859, despite being known as one of the town's most sure-footed workers. Pietro Rossini had died in 1864 when a supposedly stable minecart crushed him against a tunnel wall, even though he had inspected the equipment himself hours before. Most recently, in 1871, Edward Flanagan had drowned in the shallow creek running through town, despite being an expert swimmer who had grown up playing in those same waters. Each death had been thoroughly investigated by the proper authorities and ruled accidental. But Margaret began to notice common threads that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. But the weather was nothing compared to the chill that had settled over the Murphy household, where three people who had once shared love and hope now lived in suspicious silence, each harboring secrets that could destroy them all. On the morning of February 14, 1874, exactly 2 months before Michael Murphy's 21st birthday, Margaret made a decision that would expose the truth behind decades of carefully orchestrated death and deception. She had spent sleepless nights devising a plan as desperate as it was dangerous. But the alternative, watching another son die to satisfy an unholy agreement made by men she had never known, was unendurable. Rather than wait for the invisible forces that had claimed Patrick and Thomas to come for Michael, Margaret decided to take the fight directly to those responsible. She had carefully studied the patterns of the previous deaths and realized each young man had died alone, isolated from potential witnesses or protectors at the crucial moment. This time would be different. Margaret began by confiding in Father O'Malley, sharing her suspicions about the contracts and begging him to provide sanctuary for Michael in the church as his birthday neared. The priest, still haunted by Thomas's death in the bell tower, initially resisted her pleas. But when Margaret showed him copies of some documents Michael had found, copies she had made in secret before Sheamus destroyed the originals, his attitude changed dramatically. Father O'Malley's own investigation into the church's historical records revealed disturbing connections between the Catholic parish and Keystone Coal and Iron dating to the company's founding. The church's construction had been fully funded by Keystone, and several priests over the years had served not just as spiritual advisors, but as witnesses to contracts and agreements that blurred the line between religious blessing and legal obligation. Most damning was the discovery of a ledger hidden behind a false wall in the church's sacristy containing detailed records of what were euphemistically called spiritual transactions. The ledger listed family names, agreement dates, and the specific terms of their obligations, including the required offerings each family was expected to make. The Murphy entry, written in Sheamus's father's distinctive handwriting, made explicit reference to 7 sons as payment for passage and prosperity. With this evidence in hand, Margaret and Father O'Malley devised a strategy to expose the conspiracy and hopefully save not just Michael, but other families still bound by similar agreements. They would need to convince other victims' relatives to come forward, gather undeniable proof of the systematic murders, and present their case to authorities outside Milfield who were not under Keystone's influence. But their plans were complicated by Michael himself, who had inherited his family's stubbornness along with a reckless courage that sometimes bordered on foolishness. When he learned what his mother and the priest were plotting, he refused to hide in the church or flee town, as they suggested. Instead, he proposed a counterplan as bold as it was risky. He would publicly confront Josiah Bentley and the other company officials, demanding they explain his brother's deaths and formally release the Murphy family from whatever obligations bound them. The confrontation occurred on a bitterly cold morning in early March, just 2 weeks before Michael's birthday. Margaret had tried to dissuade her son, but Michael was determined to force the truth into the open, whatever the cost. He arrived at the Keystone offices carrying a copy of his grandfather's original contract and demanding an immediate meeting with Bentley and the company's board. What followed was a scene witnesses described as both terrifying and surreal. Bentley, faced with evidence he thought destroyed, transformed from his usual composed self into a state approaching panic. He began speaking rapidly in what sounded like a mix of English and another language observers couldn't identify, his eyes darting constantly toward the windows as if expecting some external threat. The other company officials present seemed equally disturbed by Michael's revelations, but their reaction was more calculating than fearful. Led by Ezra Caldwell, not the doctor, but his cousin, who served as Keystone's chief legal counsel, they huddled in whispered consultation before presenting Michael with what they called a final settlement offer. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. In exchange for Michael's silence about the contracts and his brother's deaths, the Murphy family would be released from all future obligations and given enough money to relocate anywhere they chose. They would have 24 hours to consider the offer, after which it would be permanently withdrawn. Michael's response was immediate and absolute. He rejected the offer and promised to take his evidence to Pennsylvania state authorities, the federal government, and newspapers, if necessary. As he turned to leave, Caldwell called after him with words that stunned everyone present. "Some debts cannot be forgiven, young Murphy. Some contracts cannot be broken. Your brothers learned that lesson, and so will you." That evening, as Michael walked home through Milfield's darkening streets, he was followed by 3 men in dark coats, the same mysterious figures Thomas had spotted from the bell tower a year earlier. But this time Michael was not alone. Margaret had arranged for several townspeople, including Father O'Malley and Dr. Ezra Caldwell, the physician, not the lawyer, to keep watch over her son, creating a protective network that would make it impossible for the company's agents to strike without witnesses. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Josiah Bentley had been found dead in his office, apparently from a massive heart attack during the night. His body was discovered slumped over his desk, his face frozen in absolute terror, his right hand clutching a half-written letter that began, "The contracts must end," before trailing off into a legible scrawl. With Bentley's death, the carefully maintained conspiracy began to unravel with shocking speed. Other Keystone officials, fearing they might be next, began confessing their roles in what they described as a system of indentured servitude operating for decades with the tacit approval of local and state authorities. The contracts they revealed were not supernatural, but brutal examples of industrial exploitation using superstition and fear to control immigrant families. The young men's deaths, while technically murders, had been carried out through methods so subtle and sophisticated they appeared to be accidents or natural causes. Patrick had been killed by a deliberately triggered gas explosion that was precisely timed and controlled. Thomas's rifle had been sabotaged with specially prepared ammunition designed to explode. The other young men had died through equally calculated methods that left no obvious evidence of foul play. But the most shocking revelation came from Dr. Caldwell's private records, detailing his forced participation in the conspiracy. As the town's only physician, he had been compelled to falsify death certificates and provide misleading testimony about the victims' deaths, all while secretly documenting the truth in his personal journals. His records revealed not just the methods used to murder the young men, but the names of the actual killers. A small group of professional assassins who traveled between company towns throughout Pennsylvania, executing similar accidents wherever immigrant families became troublesome or their sons reached an age where they might challenge the established order. Michael Murphy lived to see his 22nd birthday, becoming the first male heir in his family to break the cycle of death that had claimed his brothers and so many others. But survival came at a cost that would haunt the Murphy family for generations. The exposure of the conspiracy brought swift and brutal retaliation from forces extending far beyond Keystone coal and iron. Within weeks of Bentley's death and the subsequent revelations, the Murphy family began receiving death threats from unknown sources. Their cottage was repeatedly vandalized. Sheamus was fired from his company position, and local merchants suddenly refused to sell them food or other necessities. More disturbing were the accidents that began plaguing other families who had come forward with their own stories of suspicious deaths and coercive contracts. Houses caught fire in the night, mine shafts collapsed unexpectedly, and several potential witnesses simply vanished. The message was clear: speaking the truth about the industrial conspiracy was itself a death sentence. Father O'Malley's church was burned to the ground in April 1874, the priest barely escaping with his life. The official investigation blamed a faulty stove, but everyone in Milfield knew it was revenge for his role in exposing the contracts. The priest relocated to a Philadelphia parish, taking copies of all the documents he had helped Margaret gather, but he would never again speak publicly about what he had witnessed in Milfield. Dr. Caldwell met a more dramatic end. Just days before he was scheduled to testify before a state commission investigating labor practices in Pennsylvania's mining towns, he was found dead in his office, apparently having taken his own life with a massive dose of laudanum. His suicide note claimed he could no longer live with the guilt of his complicity in the murders, but those who knew him well doubted he would have chosen such a cowardly exit. The Murphy family themselves barely survived the retribution that followed their defiance. In May 1874, Sheamus was found beaten unconscious on the road outside town. His attackers were unknown, but their message was clear. Margaret began suffering mysterious illnesses that left her weak and often bedridden, symptoms that persisted despite treatment from doctors brought from Pittsburgh. Even young Brendan, the youngest Murphy son, still only 14, was targeted for harassment at school and on the streets, making it clear the family's persecution would continue indefinitely if they remained in Milfield. Faced with the choice between continued resistance and survival, the Murphys made the painful decision to abandon everything they had built in Pennsylvania and start over somewhere far from Keystone coal and iron's reach. In the summer of 1874, using money they had secretly saved over the years plus a modest settlement negotiated through intermediaries, the Murphy family purchased train tickets to Oregon Territory, where Sheamus had heard Irish immigrants could find work in lumber mills without the suffocating control of company towns. They left Milfield in the dead of night, carrying only what they could fit in 2 traveling bags, abandoning their cottage, their possessions, and the graves of Patrick and Thomas. The journey west was harrowing, not just from the physical hardships of cross-country travel in 1874, but from the constant fear that their enemies had followed them. At every stop, Sheamus would scan the crowds for familiar faces or signs of professional killers, while Margaret clutched her remaining sons close and prayed they had not simply delayed the inevitable. They settled in a small logging town called Cedar Falls, nestled in the Cascade Mountains about 60 miles east of Portland. The work was hard and dangerous, but it was honest labor without the web of contracts and obligations that had trapped them in Pennsylvania. For the first time in years, the Murphy family began to hope they had escaped their cursed fate. Michael married a local woman named Sarah Donnelly in 1876 and worked as a timber cruiser, evaluating forest stands for sawmill companies. He lived quietly and cautiously, never speaking of his past and always watching for signs that the darkness from Pennsylvania had followed him west. He and Sarah had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son they named Patrick in honor of Michael's deceased brother. Brendan, the youngest Murphy son, grew to adulthood in Oregon and seemed to have completely escaped the shadow over his family. He became a school teacher and later a principal, respected in his community, and apparently free from the curse that had claimed his older brothers. When he reached his 21st birthday in 1880, the family held its breath. But the day passed without incident, and they began to believe the nightmare was truly over. But the Murphy family's relief was premature. In 1885, when Michael's son Patrick turned 16, he began having strange dreams and an overwhelming urge to research his family's history. Despite his father's desperate attempts to keep the past buried, young Patrick somehow learned about his grandfather's contracts and his uncle's deaths, and he became obsessed with understanding the full truth of what happened in Pennsylvania. The boy's obsession led him to seek surviving records from the Keystone coal and iron conspiracy. And through a network of labor activists and journalists, he managed to piece together much of the story his family had tried so hard to forget. What he discovered was that the Murphy family's ordeal was part of a much larger system of industrial exploitation operating throughout the eastern United States for decades, using immigrant families as disposable resources in the pursuit of profit. More disturbing was his discovery that some families involved in similar contracts had never escaped their obligations. Even after relocating, the industrial interests that created these control systems had evolved and adapted, finding new ways to maintain their hold over families they considered property. Young Patrick's investigations brought unwanted attention to the Murphy family's new life in Oregon. And in the spring of 1887, Just months before his 21st birthday, Michael began noticing the same warning signs that had preceded his brother's deaths. Strangers in town asking about the family, unexplained accidents involving people who had befriended them, and a general sense of being watched and evaluated by invisible observers. This time, however, the Murphy family was prepared. Using knowledge from their previous experiences and aided by allies in the labor movement, they developed a strategy to protect Patrick that went beyond simple hiding or flight. They would confront their pursuers directly, but with overwhelming force and in circumstances that would make it impossible for the killers to operate with their usual secrecy. On March 15, 1888, exactly 20 years after Patrick Murphy Sr. died in Shaft 7, his nephew and namesake celebrated his 21st birthday, surrounded by more than 50 armed supporters in Cedar Falls, Oregon's main square. The event had been publicized throughout the region as a demonstration against industrial violence, and reporters from 3 different newspapers were present to document whatever might occur. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and decisive. 3 men in dark coats, the same type of professional killers who had stalked the Murphy family for years, approached the celebration with obvious intent to harm young Patrick, but they found themselves facing not a single vulnerable target, but a crowd of angry loggers, miners, and labor activists who had been waiting for this moment. The would-be assassins were captured alive, and under interrogation, they revealed their employers' names and the extent of the conspiracy that had operated in secret for decades. Their confessions led to arrests and investigations that exposed similar operations in 12 states, resulting in the prosecution of dozens of industrialists and the liberation of hundreds of families trapped in systems of hereditary servitude. The final victory came in 1889 when the last original contract was formally nullified by federal court order, and the Murphy family, along with all other affected families, was officially declared free from any obligations to their former employers. The precedent their case set helped establish new labor laws making such exploitation illegal throughout the United States. Patrick Murphy Jr. lived to see his own children grow up without fear. And the Murphy name, once synonymous with tragedy and mysterious death, became associated with courage and the fight against industrial oppression. The 7 graves in the Pennsylvania cemetery remain as monuments to the young men who died too soon. But they also serve as reminders that even the most entrenched systems of exploitation can be challenged and overcome by ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Dr. Ezra Caldwell's journals, discovered after his death, were eventually published and became instrumental in exposing similar conspiracies throughout the industrial Northeast. His detailed documentation of the methods used to murder the young men led to reforms in mining safety, labor law, and industrial accident investigations that saved countless lives in the following decades. The town of Milfield itself did not survive the scandal emerging from the Murphy case. Keystone Coal and Iron declared bankruptcy in 1875, and without the company, the community gradually dispersed as families sought opportunities elsewhere. Today, only a few building foundations mark where so much suffering occurred, and the cemetery where Patrick and Thomas Murphy lie has become overgrown and forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians. But their story endures as a testament to the power of ordinary people to resist extraordinary evil, and as a reminder that the price of freedom is often measured in blood, sacrifice, and the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. The Murphy family's ordeal began with contracts signed in desperation by immigrants seeking a better life for their children. But it ended with the destruction of a system that had claimed hundreds of lives over more than half a century. And this mystery shows us that the most terrifying horrors are often not supernatural, but profoundly human, born from greed, sustained by fear, and perpetuated by our willingness to look the other way when convenient. The Murphy sons died not because of a curse or otherworldly forces, but because powerful men decided their lives were acceptable sacrifices for economic prosperity. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets buried in the ruins of places like Milfield? Leave your comment below and let me know if you think such conspiracies could exist in today's world. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories about hidden American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The truth is often stranger and more frightening than any fiction, and there are still stories waiting to be told about the dark corners of our nation's past. See you in the next video.